In the early 1800s, a French thinker by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville came to America so he could study the prison system. But as he journeyed through the country, he discovered something much darker, that there was a divide based upon skin complexion that seemed intricately woven into the fabric of American society. And so his time here led him to a haunting conclusion, one that suggested that this divide might be America's greatest and most unbreakable challenge. So in this video, what we're going to discuss is what Tocqueville saw and some of his profound conclusions based upon those dark observations. And so for us to do so, we're going to read from the book here. It's called The Black Image in the White Mind by Dr. George M. Fredrickson. And so let's go in here and turn to page 21, where he writes this. Evidence that the colonizationist analysis had a logic that transcended crude Negrophobia can be found in Alexis de Tocqueville's observations on the racial situation in the United States. Arriving from France in 1831 when the movement was at the height of its popularity, Tocqueville made a point of discussing white-black relations with leading colonizationists. What movement was at the height of popularity? It was the colonizationist movement, which sought to emancipate the enslaved and then ship them to the African continent. And one of the reasons for that is because they did not believe that the blacks could ever live peacefully amongst the whites in this country. And in addition to that, they also did not want to deal with the social issue that the newly freed people would add to the country if they were emancipated and allowed to remain. And so these views by the colonizationists were particularly appealing to Tocqueville, who discussed the white and black relation with the leaders of the movement in 1831. Now let's continue. One of them, John Latrobe of Maryland, succinctly described the situation to him as he saw it.
The black and white population are in a state of war. Never will they mingle. One of them will have to yield place to the other.
That's what he told Tocqueville, that there was a war going on outside, or more precisely, an occurrence of an intense social conflict. And one of these people would have to bow down to the will of the other. And Alexis de Tocqueville, he's going to later on give his opinion as to who he believed would not survive this conflict. But let's keep reading to see how this perspective unfolds. Tocqueville was powerfully influenced by testimony of this kind, and presented in Democracy in America what amounted to a full and articulate statement of the colonizationist view of American racial realities. Although he ultimately concluded that colonization itself was impractical as a solution to the problem that the colonizationists had perceived, Tocqueville paid tribute to the movement as based on
a lofty and fruitful idea.
One of the reasons it was impractical to emancipate Negroes and then send them to Africa was due to the financial cost, which we discussed in an earlier commentary. It would have been a massive project that cost way too much money to send all of them from America to the faraway land of Africa. And although it was impractical, Tocqueville did like the idea, and he liked the movement because he saw it as a peaceful way to minimize the ongoing social conflict between the blacks and the whites. But here we go. Furthermore, Tocqueville's own observations seem to confirm the notion that American Negrophobia was widespread and
deeply rooted.
In carrying out his mission to inspect the American penal system, he found the color line drawn even among those deprived of their freedom because of crimes against society. It was surprising at first to discover that prisons separated white and black convicts, or that the Philadelphia House of Refuge, a kind of reform school for young delinquents, refused to admit Negroes on any basis. As the director explained,
it would be degrading to the white children to associate them with beings given up to public scorn.
This is another aspect of the societal rituals created to reinforce the idea of white supremacy. Even the white criminals were given a sense of superiority over the blacks by not placing them together in prison, right? It was looked at as degrading according to this quote. And it was not just here, but everywhere Tocqueville went, he found similar examples of racial antipathy and discrimination in all areas of life. He was forced to conclude that racial prejudice actually increased with emancipation and was worse in the free North than in the slave South. There must have been many people who smuggled the drug called white supremacy up to the free North. And when it got there, the people puffed on big packs of it, and they got so high that the Frenchman himself believed the prejudice to be worse for the emancipated folks in the North than it was in the slave South, right? Here we go. Furthermore, He could observe with his own eyes the condition of the
freed blacks,
whom he described as
condemned by the laws and public opinion to a hereditary state of misery and degradation.
he saw the pressure that the white society placed on the blacks, and he witnessed with his own eyes the tool of the law being used to keep the blacks down in the dungeon. It was from such observations, therefore, as well as from the testimony of conservatives of the colonizationist type, that Tocqueville derived his analysis of the American racial situation. His major point was that the progenitors of Negro slavery had entailed upon their descendants a race problem for which emancipation provided no answer. His major point was that the fathers of black slavery, which were the early European colonizers, created the black and white problem, and then they left it for their descendants. And simply setting the blacks free wasn't going to solve it. That's what he's talking about. The abolition of slavery, as he saw it, was always followed by the necessity of absorbing the ex-slaves into the community, which meant, in effect, reconstructing society on a new basis. Basically, America and its people had to be reinvented. The entire society had to be remodeled, which included its ideas, its identities, its laws, the culture, and the society's goals if the slaves were to ever be successfully absorbed into the community. And he was right about this. Now let's hear some more about his suggestions on remaking the society. This had to be done because no society could maintain public peace and tranquility with a large and permanently discontented pariah class in its midst. No society can keep the peace indefinitely when it has a large, marginalized group that feels oppressed. And that's because it's human nature to rebel when people are systematically taken advantage of. Rebellion and oppression are like yin and yang. They exist together, and one fuels the other. Tocqueville understood this dynamic very well, and he recognized it long before many Americans were able to. And even today, still a lot of Americans fail to grasp this concept, right? But here we go. In the ancient world, it had been possible to reconstitute the community after emancipation because there had been no visible sign of slave origin to keep alive for very long the inevitable social prejudice against freedmen and their descendants. Slavery in the ancient world was a normal part of all societies, but it wasn't based upon skin color and the attempt to create generational slaves based upon physical differences. The Europeans, on the other hand, they determined that the ancient slave system wasn't good enough for their goals. And so what did they do? They pivoted and they elevated the slave system to the highest level known to mankind. And part of their system was this attempt to leave a permanent mark of inferiority on people with richer skin tones. Now, the ancient peoples, they weren't on this level of thinking, which is why the slaves in that era could potentially be brought into the community after emancipation. Now let's get some more. But in the United States, as in other parts of the New World, slavery had been reserved for men of a different color, and this conjunction of servitude and color, which made the ex-slave readily and permanently identifiable, had planted the seeds of disaster by creating a problem of race more fundamental and difficult to solve than the problem of slavery. On the basis of what he had seen and heard of white American attitudes toward the free Negro, Tocqueville described what seemed likely to remain the situation so long as whites and blacks attempted to inhabit the same territory.
The two races,
He wrote,
are fastened to each other without intermingling, and they are alike unable to separate entirely or combine.
stuck at the hips like Siamese twins, but unable to get along with each other. The whites needed the blacks to reinforce their idea of whiteness, and the blacks relied on whites to understand their assigned low status of blackness. And he suggested that this situation constituted
the most formidable of all the ills that threaten the future of the Union.
Tocqueville's vision of the future of the blacks in America was cataclysmic. Slavery would inevitably come to an end, he predicted, because it was incompatible with modern civilization and the trend of world opinion, but emancipation would be followed by a race war which would result in the extermination of the blacks except possibly
along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico,
where they might have the numbers to hold their own. The only conceivable alternative was social acceptance, accompanied by the possibility of intermarriage, and this was ruled out by the fact that a sense of the physical differences between whites and Negroes, when combined with historically derived prejudice, made such contacts unimaginable.
His physiognomy is to our eyes hideous.
Tocqueville wrote of the Negro as he was usually perceived by the white man.
His understanding weak, his taste low, and we are almost inclined to look upon him as a being intermediate between man and the brutes.
Now, these weren't Tocqueville's personal opinions about those labeled as blacks. He was describing through the lens of white Americans how blacks were often viewed, which was physically hideous to the eyes and inferior in intellectual ability. And because of this, some of the whites sought to place the blacks somewhere between the humans and other species of animals.
To induce the whites to abandon the opinion they have conceived of the moral and intellectual inferiority of their former slaves,
He added in a footnote,
the Negroes must change, but as long as this opinion persists, they cannot change.
the people had to stop being black people. This is what this is talking about. Not a physical change, but a moral, cultural, character, and a consciousness change. And that's because the slave environment makes people develop ways of thinking and also characteristics that are suitable for that environment, which is where the Negro was created. So it made sense to Tocqueville that they would have to change many things about themselves to be more fitting for a free environment. However, Tocqueville explained that this transformation was impossible because the persistent and prejudiced white opinion acted as a powerful barrier which reinforced the very stereotypes that it sought to eliminate. So, in addition, the whites had to stop being white people, right? Let's keep going. In presenting this early description of a
Vicious circle.
in black-white relations, Tocqueville, unlike later and more optimistic exponents of the idea, left no doubt that he, like the colonizationists, saw no effective way to break the circle as long as America remained a biracial society. Although Tocqueville was convinced that the colonization movement had a correct perception of the dangers to America of an oppressed black population, he found its solution to the problem totally unrealistic. Even if colonizationists had a government subsidy, he contended, they would never even be able to send enough blacks to Liberia to drain off the natural increase of the slave population. If the federal government undertook to purchase slaves for colonization, the cost would turn out to be enormous and unacceptable to the North, unless the price was fixed at a low level. But that in turn would lead to the South's rejection of the plan. So the path of sending large numbers of blacks to Africa was blocked off due to the financial burden. And in the bigger scheme of things, it just was not meant to be, at least for the vast majority of them and their descendants as well. And so from here, we've seen how the Frenchman Tocqueville came to America to examine the prison system, but was also drawn into the large social problems at the time. The black youth were segregated from the whites in prison so they would not degrade the status of the whites. We also heard about the black and whites being in a social war. We heard about the white opinion about the blacks and how this acted as a barrier to the blacks making any type of change. And Tocqueville also described how the law was set up in a way to keep the Negro down in the pit. And all of this was behind his conclusion that America needed a complete reform of its entire society. And this had to be the case if the enslaved were to ever be freed and integrated into the community. So think about that while the information takes root in your unconscious mind. And so with that being said, I hope you found some value in this video. I thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.